We have with us Kevin Page, former parliamentary budget officer, now at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. And Kevin, actually today I feel as though it's the second part of the Institute's name that is in some ways the most important, the democracy part, just in terms of, what government spending in a time of crisis. We give them a lot of leeway, as one should, of course, because there was lots of support that was needed. But at what point should the democratic processes start to kick in, transparency, accountability, and have we gone past that point?
Yeah, I mean, from the democracy perspective, that obviously you don't want. I mean, democracies are being strained right now because of the pandemic. Parliament's been, shut down to a large degree because of the pandemic, and finances are actually shooting up, as you and Greg have kind of discussed. So I think as we kind of move forward, and Greg was right, as we kind of start talking about the recovery, we're hoping with the update that we'll see in a few weeks, I think that will give us another snapshot in addition to Mr. Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer, snapshot today. But, hopefully we start, the fall with a budget and something a bit more substantive than a snapshot. And it kind of lays out what Greg thought we need, which is a recovery plan. What does 2020, the fall, look like? What does 2021 look like?
And, we've seen some difficulty even with the massive spending bill that is sort of would include the next evolution of the CERB, for instance, hitting some roadblocks in Parliament. Democracy's messy. We have a minority government. That's all to be expected. But how important is it that we actually have a government that can get other parties on the same page and get some of these bills through? Because it's one thing to make announcements about things, but until you pass a bill, it can't actually happen.
Yeah, so I see more positives than negatives, even just in the lead up to the passage of that appropriations bill, Supplementary Estimates A. I think the discussions that you wanted. I mean, you look at the opposition parties, they want to return to Parliament. Another party wanted a fiscal update. Another party wanted some adjustments to some of the more audit aspects that are being needed, concerns about fraud with respect to the CERB program. So I think that's important, and we need to hear from opposition parties. We go back to 2008-9. In that environment of global financial crisis, it was the opposition parties that pushed for stimulus. It was the opposition parties that pushed for quarterly financial reports, and we got that. And I think actually the government of the day, Prime Minister Harper's government, benefited by that push from opposition parties.
So just give us a sense. We're just talking about, these kind of large numbers and whether people's eyes sort of glaze over and they become kind of immune to the idea that this is a problem. At what point, and I know we keep kind of saying we have the fiscal capacity and, we're in a better position than other countries, et cetera, but at what point do we just say, well, that's too big a number, or we're beginning to get worried, or we need a plan because it's a large enough amount?
Yeah, so I think, those debt limits that economists will talk about, they're being experienced in different parts of the world, certainly Southern Europe. I think a lot of developing economies are going to be under significant debt distress as we kind of look forward into 2021. I think Canada's debt to GDP ratio, at least at the federal level, if we find ourselves in the 50% range, we're still a ways away from what anybody would call a debt limit in Canada, or really, I think, a significant risk that we would lose our AAA status. Having said that, I think the government has this opportunity now with this fiscal update and with the budget early in the fall to kind of come out and reestablish a fiscal planning framework, talk about, some fiscal anchors, new fiscal anchors that need to be recalibrated because of the COVID-19 and all the fiscal supports. So, I mean, again, there's risks and opportunities in this environment. The government's been more concerned about the risks with putting out numbers that get back to Greg's point. But I think the opportunities are really to start to deal with the uncertainty around the economy. Where is the government going? How is it going to play come the fall? Including providing some ease to people that are worried about high debt.
And we just on that point of kind of the ability to make forecasts and how hard it is to forecast long term, how comfortable would you be? You've done this. You review all of this data all the time. Are we now in a position where you can start to kind of get a sense with, big asterisks of things that could still go wrong or take us in different directions, but that we could begin to forecast the next, say 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, so I think there's still there's enormous uncertainty. We've seen that in the reports. I think particularly the recent report from the OECD where they came out with two scenarios One, a scenario with no second wave in terms of an increase in an infection rate. Another one with a scenario with a second wave that would, really deepen, this recession that we're trying to grasp. How deep will it be in 2020? So yeah, I think the future now is definitely a scenario, as you talked about it. We saw it in the Bank of Canada. We saw it in the IMF and the OECD document. So yeah, these updates or these budgets, they're going to have to be scenario based. And, we live in this environment where we don't have a vaccine. And I think we know that the economic outcomes will be tied to our ability to slow the transmission of this virus in the meantime.
We are starting to hear a more optimistic tone. We heard it from the Bank of England again, and some would argue overly optimistic in a way, that they're sort of calling that the worst may be over. Do you think from an economist's point of view, we could start to say that we can start to say, if nothing else goes wrong, that we may have put this behind us, at least economically?
Yeah, I think so, Amanda. Just from an arithmetic perspective, when people look at GDP and we build in these enormous drops, literally hundreds of billions of dollars of drops in GDP in the second quarter from the first quarter. And anyway, I think, and you start to see some of the labor market numbers, we'll see other indicators, you start to see a bit of a bounce. So that's, the bounce is not, it's positive. It's moving in the right direction. Like in the case of the labor market, we saw growth in both the goods and the service sectors. But I think we still know that we're such a long ways away from where we were, even in the fourth quarter of 2019. That'll be another benchmark that people have in the back of their head. Like, how long will it take us to get back to where we were literally 6 months ago? And it could literally take us a year and a half. But I think, is the worst over? I think as we start to open up businesses, I think you're going to start to see growth, but it's from a very low point, that drop off that we found ourselves in the second quarter.
Given the numbers that we're talking about here, Kevin, do you see austerity in our future one way or another? I mean, will there have to be higher taxes or lower spending on programs at some point?
At some point, I think there will be. And again, I've lived long enough, Amanda, to know that after the recession in the early 80s, after the recession in the early 90s, after the 2008 financial crisis, we had austerity. I think it's the economy, the size of these negative output gaps is going to be so large that austerity in the short term over the next few years is going to be wrong for countries like Canada that haven't hit their debt limit. But absolutely, I think as we kind of move forward, 2022, 23, people figure out, like, what kind of debt are we okay living with? Like, how much fiscal space do we want to leave for future generations? I think, there'll be another round of austerity.
Kevin Page, always great to have your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Kevin Page is with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy.